Take it away.
Thanks. Thank you, Ryan. Good afternoon, and thanks, Ryan, for inviting me. It's a very cool venue, and I'm going to be as brief as I can. I'm Paul Tyson. I'm with Paul Media. We are an outdoor advertising firm established in 1996, based here in New York City, and have worked since that time to develop revenue streams for landlords, building owners, as well as public institutions. We've done business with about 120 municipalities. Thank you. Thanks. About 120 municipalities around the country, and more recently developed, about starting 2 years ago, a digital TV network inside of healthcare facilities. It's a very dynamic business that's growing. But today I wanted to talk to you about outdoor advertising and what might work for you. And just as a show of hands, how many building owners are here today? Quite a few. And how many of you have had dealings or leases for outdoor advertising? I'm just curious. Okay, not too many. So when we talk about outdoor advertising, you can see a listing here of some of the different types that you probably know: billboards, wallscapes, and scaffolding wraps. There are others. We're going to stick to some of the basics here. And if we go to the next slide, show you some graphics. This is a traditional billboard. It can be built on a rooftop, it can be built on a pole in a parking lot or a lot adjacent to your building. Involves considerable capital investment. So these are typically 10 to 20 years, sometimes 30-year leases. And next slide. More recently, starting about 10 years ago in a big way, advertisers showed interest in what we call wallscapes. And the reason that this really took off is really technology. The vinyl that you see here on the side of the building is a perforated vinyl. So unlike the old days where it was a very heavy material, it's very light. It's actually porous. It's like a perforated vinyl. And can be put on a building in a very secure way, tightened down, tight as a drum, and actually allows the light to come through it. So even for some commercial buildings where, like this one, where the windows are being covered, light is let in, and for a lot of landlords and building owners, that makes it, let's say, acceptable and balances out the, in this case, significant revenue that is being generated by this sign. This building is on the Major Deegan, as you can see from the sign. It actually has 3 sides generating advertising income. The next slide would show you more of what we'd call a neighborhood wall. This is a 4-story walk-up. It's got signage on both sides of the building. Generates for the landlord not nearly the revenue that you saw in the previous location, but generates, again, proportionately a pretty good sum for the landlord. And the last slide is something that's more recent. It actually, I'll talk about regulations in a minute. These are called scaffolding wraps. So a sidewalk shed goes up, and advertisers love them because it can be 200, 300, 500 feet long, and lots of room to advertise, and there's a price tag that's pretty high accordingly. The city shut this down about a year ago. And so now you see a lot of empty sheds, sidewalk sheds, or you see on-premise advertising. So if it's a condo, it's advertisement for renting condominiums. There is a proposal in the city right now in City Hall and the Department of Buildings to get these scaffolding sheds back and have a permitting process so that there's an orderly way that the city can regulate how these are handled. The industry, the ad industry, is hoping these come back. It certainly would be an excellent opportunity for building owners, because whenever you do facade work or you're doing any kind of construction that you need a sidewalk shed, you have an opportunity simultaneously to generate revenue. Next slide, please. So what are the characteristics of a good location? Some of these are obvious. You're facing vehicular, pedestrian traffic in major streets. Sometimes we have building owners calling us, trying to show us buildings on a side street or a dead end, and I mean, it's just, if it's in the middle of Soho, that's one thing, but if it's off of a major arterial highway, set, far from an arterial highway, or if it's not in a busy area, it's typically not viable. It's large enough of a space to have an impact, and when I say large enough, typically talking 2 to 3, maybe 400 square feet on the side of a building, minimum, and then up from there. The large one I showed you earlier is about 6,000 square feet of signage. The view should be unobstructed, and that sounds obvious, but there are things that can come into play with the building where the way it's being used, or maybe something going on in the adjacent lot, would cause obstruction. That's difficult for an advertising company to sell something that's not visible 100% of the time for their clients. And then the final part, not mandatory, but it's always better if it's near retail or commercial activity. So if you're selling to a sporting goods brand, if you can show them that there are Waddell's and playgrounds and sports authorities and basketball courts, they love to see spotted maps. We show them all the sporting activity going around in the area so they can correlate what they're advertising with the demand in the market. The regulatory environment in New York City is relatively complicated. The city, from 1979, when they grandfathered hundreds of highway signs, until just a few years ago, the city really did not monitor nor enforce a lot of their signage laws. So you saw them growing like mushrooms. If you go out of the Midtown Tunnel toward JFK, you saw them where there were 3, now there are 30, and it caused a lot of problems for both the government and the industry. They've worked through a lot of those issues. I talked about the scaffolding regulation. There's similar regulations that have always been on the books, but now they're being enforced. So the laws are, let's say, being enforced, still offering opportunities for building owners and advertising companies, and would love to talk with any of you who have interest in that after the presentation. The grandfathering of signs, if you have, for example, an old building that had a sign on it in 1937, and there are examples of this, and it's, for example, an old painted sign, and you have proof of that, there are ways to have your signage grandfathered, and you become, in a sense, exempt from any of the current changes in regulation or enforcement. On-premise permits are being used creatively by some people. So if you have, I was explaining to Adam here, if you have a building with a tenant, the tenant has the right to secure an on-premise advertising.